The AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, law professor Adam Winkler on how even the Founding Fathers believed in gun control. Political scientist Jeanne Theoharis on how the history of the civil rights movement has been sanitized and why. And Bill Press talks with candidate Michael Eggman from California's 10th District. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Adam Winkler has written extensively on the history of gun control and the mythology that has come to dominate our current debate. He says that laws to enhance gun safety are as old as the founding of our country. And we say hello to Adam Winkler, law professor at UCLA, specializing in constitutional law. He's the author of Gunfight, The Battle Over the Right to Bear Arms in America, and most recently, We the Corporations, How American Businesses Won Their Civil Rights. Adam Winkler, thank you so much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, our pleasure to have you with us. Among the many myths you challenge in your book is about the Founding Fathers. And contrary to many interpretations of their legacy is that they were, in fact, concerned about public safety when it came to guns. How did they express that concern?
Well, they expressed it most obviously in the text of the Second Amendment, which refers to the necessity of a well-regulated militia. The Founding Fathers strongly believed that individuals should have the right to bear arms and wrote the Second Amendment to secure that right. Yet they also had gun control. They barred large portions of the population from possessing guns, including slaves, blacks, even free blacks, and even white men who opposed the revolution. People who refused to swear an oath of loyalty to the revolution saw their gun rights restricted. And they even had laws that prohibited the possession of a loaded weapon in any building in Boston. The main concern wasn't that someone would use a gun improperly, but rather guns were a safety hazard, largely because of their gunpowder and the explosiveness of gunpowder. So the Founding Fathers were concerned about public safety and wanted to regulate guns. They understood the dangers of a armed civilian population.
Mm-hmm. Now, given your close read of history, is there any doubt the Founding Fathers wrote the Second Amendment to speak to a collective right regarding militias and not an individual right?
I think it was actually much more complicated. I don't think they viewed it in the same ways that we view it. Guns were not particularly effective back at the time for personal self-defense. They were effective as hunting weapons, and you used them in warfare, but because of how long it took to load a gun, and you couldn't keep a gun loaded because of the explosiveness of the gunpowder, it was not a good self-defense tool. I think the Founding Fathers did believe that individual civilians should have a right to have possession of firearms in their own home, and for reasons of self-defense, but it was self-defense of the nation. And so it was oriented around a militia for the founders, but it may have also been an individual right associated with the militia.
Mm-hmm. But still, you can't escape the fact that it was a different world then than it is now, and our interpretation certainly is different from perhaps, even regardless of their intention. I mean, there's no way that they could have speculated, the 21st century. Another history you write about is that of the Wild West, a place we often think of as indiscriminate when it comes to guns. Again, this is a myth?
Well, yeah. I mean, our image of the Wild West is so wrong because we've sort of mythologized what the Wild West looked like. We all know the image: a gunslinger walking around a Wild West town, 6 shooters on each hip, a rifle in each hand, and a duel on Main Street every day at noon. But one of the most remarkable things I discovered in writing Gunfight was that our popular understanding of the Wild West couldn't be more inaccurate. The frontier towns, places like Dodge City, Deadwood, or Tombstone, they had the most restrictive gun laws in the nation. If you came into one of these frontier towns, you had to check your guns. Like, I don't know, you might check your coat at a Boston restaurant in the winter. And there was very little violence in these towns, which saw an average of less than 2 murders a year. It turns out there wasn't much reason to get out of Dodge.
We're speaking with Adam Winkler, law professor at UCLA, specializing in constitutional law, author of the book Gunfight, The Battle Over the Right to Bear Arms in America, and his most recent book, We the Corporations, How American Businesses Won Their Civil Rights. Adam, your book also looks at the history of the NRA, and you write that the NRA, when it first began, was actually open-minded about gun control. Can you expand on that?
Well, the NRA was not always the die-hard, no-compromises opponent of gun control that we know today. I mean, the NRA was founded after the Civil War, ironically by a reporter for a newspaper not known for its support of gun rights, the New York Times. And in the 1920s and 1930s, the NRA was at the forefront of the gun control movement, drafting restrictive laws about public carry, for instance, and promoting them in state after state. When Congress was considering the first major federal gun control law in the 1930s, the president of the NRA was asked in the congressional hearing whether it violated the Second Amendment. And he said, "I have not given it any study from that point of view." And indeed, before the 1960s, the NRA and its publications rarely mentioned the Second Amendment at all. It wasn't until the NRA was transformed in the 1970s that the Second Amendment became the organization's heart and soul.
Well, so what changed in the 70s?
Well, there was literally a coup, an overnight coup in the leadership of the NRA. So in the early 1970s, the leadership of the NRA was compromising, moderate, and wanted to retreat from political activity and move the headquarters out of Washington to Colorado Springs so that they could refocus the organization on outdoors activity and hunting. And this angered a group of hardliners in the membership, who thought that guns were more effective at shooting criminals than they were at shooting ducks. And these hardliners secretly organized, and at the annual membership meeting in 1977, this group of hardliners hatched their secret plan, and manipulating the rules of order, they basically threw out the entire board of the NRA and replaced them overnight with a group of hardliners who were totally committed to political advocacy and no holds barred fighting against gun control.
Why is it important to be more precise about the history of gun control, and what is the danger of getting that story wrong?
Well, I think, unfortunately, the NRA has been selling a story about the Second Amendment that emphasizes only half of the amendment. There was once at the NRA's headquarters, they once had etched over the doorway a sign that said, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed," quoting from the Second Amendment, but completely omitting the first half of the Second Amendment that talks about the necessity of a well-regulated militia. And I think that's part of the problem, is that the NRA sold us a story that's a very one-sided view of the Second Amendment, that it's all about gun rights and not at all about gun regulation, when the story of guns in America is more nuanced, it is more complex, and we can actually find a long history and tradition of efforts to regulate guns in the public interest. And so gun control is not some modern 20th century invention, but really inherent in a society that has made the choice to let civilians have guns.
And yet their marketing, if you will, the NRA, it has left the opinions of those supporters also quoting only specific portions of that Second Amendment, which favor their point of view. And that seems to be an ongoing problem. How do you combat that?
Well, I think you can just combat it by political advocacy and education and mobilization. We are seeing a new mobilization in the gun control movement. Ever since the Newtown shooting in December of 2012, a lot of people have been frustrated because they've seen nothing happen at the federal level, and that's a fair criticism. At the same time, we have seen the gun debate be really changed. We've seen a lot more political advocacy and mobilization on the gun control side, especially now in the wake of Parkland with all these students. And I do think that ultimately our gun policy is not set by the Second Amendment. Our gun policy has been set by a political coalition that's run by the NRA led by the NRA that's become very powerful in America. And the way to combat the NRA is going to be through political mobilization.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Adam Winkler, law professor at UCLA, specializing in constitutional law, talking about his book, Gunfight, The Battle Over the Right to Bear Arms in America. You mentioned Parkland, Florida. Several gun measure controls, of course, have been rising to the top since then as well. One is the Gun Violence Restraining Order, otherwise known as GVRO. This is one, though, you're not optimistic about. Why?
Well, I actually think the gun violence restraining orders are a very good idea in the sense that they provide families and friends who see someone in serious mental trouble who might have firearms. It gives those people an opportunity to go to a judge and to temporarily take those guns away. And that might be effective in maybe preventing a mass shooting. So I think they're a good idea for that reason. But I don't think they're going to do very much to bring down the daily death toll from gun violence. And gun violence restraining orders are only one small piece of a larger set of reforms of American gun laws that we need. And we shouldn't put too much hope or too much faith in those GVROs.
What about training teachers to use guns when needed? It suggests more guns are safer. Does history have a lesson on this?
History doesn't support the argument that more guns make us safer. I mean, we know that we have a society with 350 million guns, and we also have far more people who are murdered and victims of gun violence than countries that don't have guns. There's no doubt about that general trend. In terms of arming teachers, there may be an exceptional teacher that's got the training and the skill and the know-how to be able to successfully defend students, but I think the idea that a good guy with a gun is going to stop a bad guy with a gun was disproven in Parkland too. There was a security officer. He was highly trained. He was designed to do this. That was part of his job to step in and protect those kids, and he didn't. And I think to expect teachers who are not focused on military training or marksmanship to also take responsibility for the safety and security of their students, I think is a mistake and not likely to be very effective.
For those who are promoting gun control, what are the strategies that hold promise to you?
I think effective advocacy and coalition building. I think that the most important thing is to get out the vote and to get more people who are single-issue pro-gun control voters. The NRA has been so strong in American politics, not just because it has a lot of money, although you need a lot of money generally to be pretty effective in American politics, but they're so effective because there's a lot of single-issue pro-gun voters who really pay attention to the NRA's endorsements, especially in primary elections. If gun control advocates can become as forceful and as mobilized and as active and as passionate as the gun rights people, they'll have a much easier time promoting better gun violence prevention laws.
Okay. Adam Winkler, law professor at UCLA, specializing in constitutional law, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org as we talk about the book Gunfight, The Battle Over the Right to Bear Arms in America. And, of course, his new book is We the Corporations, How American Businesses Won Their Civil Rights. Adam, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America. Whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job, that's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, more myths from American history and why we need a more honest telling of the civil rights movement. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Workplace exploitation is at least as old as the Industrial Revolution. But rather than using whips to make the assembly lines move ever faster, today's corporate exploiters use technology, devious work schedules, and lobbyists to extract more work from employees for less pay. Walmart, for example, wants to provide next-day delivery for online customers by having its low-wage workforce use their own time and vehicles to drop off packages as they go home after work. Economists have a technical term for these corporate ploys: stealing. One entire group being victimized by corporate thieves are the 4.3 million Americans who make up our tipped workforce, mostly employed as waitstaff in restaurants, from big chains like IHOP to the most exclusive dining establishments. These workers fall under a grossly unjust category of labor law that allows their employers to pay a miserly minimum wage as low as $2.13 an hour. The rationale is that customers will subsidize this sub-poverty pay by leaving generous tips, a convenient corporate lie refuted by the fact that the income of tipped workers is a third less than non-tipped, and they are nearly twice as likely to live in poverty. Luckily, Trump has intervened to help. Lucky for restaurant owners, that is. Bowing to demands by restaurant industry lobbyists, Trump's Labor Department has proposed a new rule allowing employers to seize workers' tips and use them for any purpose, including fattening their own profits. Paying $2.13 an hour already amounts to a massive wage theft, but this elevates it to legalized highway robbery. This is Jim Hightower saying, even the most notorious robbers in history would be too ashamed to pull a job this wicked, but today's corporate greed and Trump's ethical bankruptcy is turning wickedness into business as usual.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Jeanne Theoharis has written an alternative history on the civil rights movement and says that the accepted history about the movement diminishes its scope and its legacy for us today. And we say hello to Jeanne Theoharis, Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Brooklyn College of the City University of New York. Her book, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, won a 2014 NAACP Image Award. In her most recent book, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, The Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History, she challenges us to a more honest telling of that moment, one that allows the activists of today to move forward in a more powerful way. Jeanne Theoharis, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you so much for having me.
And our pleasure to have you with us. You have been quoted as saying that the history of the civil rights movement has been, quote unquote, whitewashed for public consumption. In broad strokes, what do you mean by that?
I think one of the things that we've seen, and this has been over the past 30 or 40 years, is that what I'm talking about in the book is a kind of a growth of a national fable of the civil rights movement. That celebrates the civil rights movement, a very kind of narrow version of the civil rights movement, to put the movement in the past, to say, look at this great movement we had, not, and again, implying that the need for a movement is over, the problem is largely over, and also as a way to celebrate the power of American democracy. So it's sort of a fable of progress, an American exceptionalism that both narrows and strips the history of the civil rights movement and shrinks it, and also I think makes it unavailable to us today in terms of many of the lessons that a fuller history of the civil rights movement really shows us.
Mm-hmm. Now, you identify some of the myths that have been woven into modern day understandings of the civil rights movement. One is that it was a Southern fight. Not true?
Right. I mean, I think the movement that's celebrated again, and this fable, I think, really begins to coalesce when President Reagan, long opposition to a king holiday, kind of shifts, and he begins to see the utility for his own sort of political and his administration's political gain in supporting the legislation, signing the bill to make the king holiday a holiday, and beginning to kind of talk about the civil rights movement as this, right, Southern, begins with Rosa Parks, the leadership of Martin Luther King, exposed injustice, defeated injustice, won, right? So it's kind of good guys, bad guys, happy ending, and then the kind of proof of the kind of the power of American democracy, because Reagan will also say when he dedicates the King holiday, right? In many places, the King would never have been able to do what he did. So we see it begin there. But again, the movement celebrated is Southernized, is always in the South, kind of a Montgomery, Birmingham, Selma kind of narrative. When, if you look more broadly at the civil rights movement during that very same period, it's also taking place in New York City, in Boston, in Detroit, in Los Angeles, in Pittsburgh, right, across the country. Then, and particularly now, that's a more uncomfortable history. It's a more uncomfortable story, both because it reveals racism not just as a Southern problem, but a national problem. It troubles this idea of kind of who the good guys were, because, again, in this sort of the story that we've come to sort of honor of the civil rights movement, right, it's a kind of courageous sort of black movement in the South, is supported by white liberals in the North, and, fights and wins the day. And I think when you begin to see a civil rights movement in the North, and that many Northern whites who may have supported the Southern struggle were less supportive when it came to sort of looking at conditions at home. Certainly, as we passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, many of the sponsors of the Civil Rights Act will build in a loophole to prevent desegregation from coming to their city schools. So part of what I'm trying to show in the book is, right, the breadth of the civil rights movement. The first two chapters look at the civil rights movement in New York, in Boston, in Detroit, in Los Angeles, in this very same decade that we associate with the Southern civil rights movement, in the kind of 54 to 65. And I think that troubles a lot of things, right? If you see a longstanding movement in places like Detroit and LA before the uprisings in those cities, those uprisings look very different. When you see a movement around housing segregation, school segregation, police brutality that is ignored, that's disparaged, that's dismissed for years before those uprisings. If you look at the long movement in New York to try to desegregate the city's schools, and the ways that New York city officials, school officials, white parents, places like the New York Times, again, dismiss and disparage that movement over many years. The kind of narrative of the civil rights movement and what that history gives us for today is very different. It's more uncomfortable, but it also, I think, points the way forward in terms of where we have to go.
And it's here we are in the 21st century now, just realizing for many people that it was always a much bigger problem than we ever gave credit for.
Right. That I think if you see this long-standing movement in northern cities, like Cleveland, like Baltimore, like St. Louis, sort of where we are today, the fact that Black Lives Matter has kind of taken off in cities like that in response to, right, long-standing problems, both in terms of police brutality, in terms of city neglect in many parts of these cities, in terms of school segregation, right? This host of problems that we see today have long roots and long routes of being ignored. And I think that, again, changes the narrative. And I think it demands a different kind of public accountability. Right? If we see longstanding problems that have been ignored, that people have swept under the rug, that people have looked askance at people who are trying to unveil those problems, again, I think that demands a different sort of accountability from us today.
Absolutely. And there's another myth that you identify that's at the heart of the movement, where there were a few charismatic men. Again, what is the history we need to remember here?
So I think many of us, right, when we think about the civil rights movement, the first person who comes to mind is Martin Luther King, right? And most of us can, would recognize a picture of Coretta Scott King, right? Know who Coretta Scott King is, but know almost nothing about her, right? So part of what I try to do in the book is sort of expand even the people we think we know. And that includes Rosa Parks, but it also includes people like Coretta Scott King, who is a political activist before she meets Martin Luther King, arguably more political than him when they meet. She complements and in many ways influences his politics when he is alive, particularly around his growing opposition to Vietnam. She is out ahead on that. Right after he gets the Nobel Prize in 1964, Coretta Scott King really thinks and begins to sort of talk to him about how this changes his responsibility to being a global responsibility. And because of that, this demands him to be out more publicly against U.S. involvement in Vietnam. She comes out publicly against U.S. involvement in Vietnam earlier than he does. And then after he's assassinated, she will sort of spend decades, right, fighting for, again, global justice and kind of global peace. She will spend decades fighting for welfare rights, anti-poverty measures, full employment. She will spend decades fighting for sort of racial justice in schools, in politics. She will, be one of the brainchild behind the 1972 National Black Convention at Gary, Indiana. So I think that larger history of someone we think we know, someone most of us would recognize, I think then shifts how we see the leadership of the civil rights movement, how we see who pushed it forward. In another chapter, I talk about the role of young people, of high school students, in pushing the civil rights struggle forward. And there I talk about, for instance, 15-year-old Barbara Johns, who in 1951 leads a strike at her high school to demand sort of better conditions, equal conditions to the white high school. This is in Prince Edward County, Virginia. Many of the adults in the community don't support it. They call the NAACP. The NAACP comes down initially to try to stop it. These young people are so determined that they get the NAACP on board. And ultimately, this will become one of the cases in the historic kind of Brown versus Board decision. This is the case coming out of Prince Edward County, started by high school students. Right? So I think started by a 15-year-old young woman. So I think part of what I'm trying to do in the book is also expand how we see who led the way, who pushed forward the civil rights struggle, being much broader than I think we often know.
Mm-hmm. And we're seeing young people very active today on other matters as well. We're speaking with Jeanne Theoharis, Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Brooklyn College of the City University of New York, and her latest book, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, The Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History. Moving into other stories about specific people, I want to ask you about someone that you have written about extensively, Rosa Parks. What do we get wrong about that story, and at what cost?
I think we get a lot of things wrong. I think, again, most people, by the time they get through elementary school now, are taught about Rosa Parks. But she is trapped on that one day on the bus. She is often described as quiet, tired, old, accidental, meek, right? All these words are used in the eulogies and obituaries written about her when she dies in 2005. Incessantly, she's referred to as quiet. The New York Times will eulogize her as the accidental matriarch of the civil rights movement. When the actual Rosa Parks spends her entire life fighting for racial justice and social justice. It begins decades before her historic bus stand. It will continue for 40 years after. She'll spend the second half of her life in Detroit, so she is as active in the Jim Crow North as the Jim Crow South. Criminal justice is one of the key issues for her. She's working on anti-rape cases. She's working on cases that involve the wrongful kind of arrests and prosecutions of Black men. She very much begins her adult political life with the Scottsboro case. Again, Scottsboro, 1931, 9 young men are arrested for riding the rails, for riding the train for free. And then when they discover 2 white women in another car, those 9 young men are quickly tried and all but the youngest one sentenced to death. A local movement grows in Alabama, and Raymond Parks, who's a barber, is one of the local activists pushing that struggle forward. When she meets him in 1931, he's working on that case. She describes him as the first real activist I ever met. They fall in love, and in many ways, that's where she begins, with Scottsboro. And through the course of her life, she's talking about kind of criminal justice. She works on all sorts of prisoner defense committees. She serves after the 1967 Detroit riot on a people's tribunal around police brutality during the riot. So she's far bigger than we know. She has a kind of steadfastness and perseverance that I think are often missed. Part of what's so staggering about the courage she shows on December 1st, 1955 is she's made stands before. Other people have made stands before. They haven't changed things. They've typically gotten people fired or hurt. And yet and still, she still refuses, right, the bus driver's order to get up and is arrested. She knows that Black women recently have been raped by police. She knows that a neighbor of hers was killed for resisting sort of getting off the bus a few years earlier, right? She knows that, and yet still she does it. I think the second thing that I think we miss is, right, by seeing the kind of scope of her politics, I think we're forced to confront sort of that many of the issues she was fighting for are still undone, right? And so I think we honor Rosa Parks increasingly, right? There's a statue of her in the Capitol. Many states are now turning to perhaps sort of dedicate a day to Rosa Parks. But what I worry about, I think what accompanies that is this sense of accomplishment, this sense of progress. And certainly there has been, I'm not saying there's no progress, but the actual Rosa Parks was adamant to the end of her life that there was much more work to be done, that the movement wasn't over. And so I think if we're really going to be serious about honoring her work and her legacy, it actually demands something of us. And I think too often the way we honor her is about feeling good about ourselves and where we are, as opposed to using that honor as a challenge to go forward.
Mm-hmm. It does have the feel, and especially in today's climate, in the immediate, where it's a couple steps forward and always a step back. It seems it's just an unbelievable, much bigger hill than we've ever been led to believe or have wanted to believe, I guess.
Right.
The title of your book is from a James Baldwin essay titled "A Talk to Teachers." What did you find in that essay that inspired you?
I think there's a lot of things. And if people haven't read that essay, it's an extraordinary essay about kind of where we are today and what it means to be honest with young people about where we are today. And it's as relevant as it was, when he wrote it 50 years ago. But the title of the book is taken from a sentence in the piece where he says, American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it. And what I found so useful there, and what I hope is useful in the book, is both kind of confronting a bigger, kind of more expansive history in the civil rights movement, right? It is a more sober history. It is a more uncomfortable history. It shows us it shows us that many of the people we cast as good guys were not necessarily so good. One thing to remember, right? Most Americans did not support the civil rights movement while it was happening. Right? 3/4 of Americans in the early 60s say they don't agree with the freedom rides and the sit-ins. Most Americans don't support the March on Washington. Even if we isolate the North, in a poll in 1964, a majority of New Yorkers say the civil rights movement has gone too far. This is a year before the Voting Rights Act, right? So part of what I think this history gives us is a more sober, a more terrible, right, picture of who we are in this country, of where we are in this country. At the same time, I do think it also, when you actually look at the variety of people who led that struggle, if you look at what people did, what people imagined, what people created, I think it's also more beautiful, right? I think it gives us more in terms of how we go forward today. And so what I liked about kind of what Baldwin is saying there, and what I hope the title of the book conveys, is both, I think, the work that this history does and asks of us, but also kind of what it gives us in terms of how to imagine what's possible.
In recent times, we have seen three remarkable movements emerge in the United States. One is the Black Lives Matter movement. Another is Me Too. And yet another, still in a nascent stage, and I started to touch on this a moment ago, is the gun reform movement being led by students. What is the history you want them to draw upon?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One, I think, and part of where I start the book is with the misuses of the civil rights movement sort of against Black Lives Matter. And one of the motivating things in finishing the book, in terms of thinking about the way the civil rights movement was being fableized and misused and weaponized, was against kind of new movements for change. And so oftentimes, like, we hear Mike Huckabee saying, King would be appalled. We hear Mayor Kasim Reed during the protests around Philando Castile and Alton Sterling's after their killings say, Dr. King would never take a freeway. Of course Dr. King would take a freeway. Right? The most famous march maybe that almost everybody knows of Dr. King, right? The Selma to Montgomery, that's on a highway, right? But somehow we have placed the civil rights movement at such a distance from where we are today that one of the things I'm hoping the book will do is shake that up, is say many of the criticisms that are being lobbed at movements like Black Lives Matter were lobbed at the civil rights movement. Many people criticize the civil rights movement. As I was just saying before, many Americans did not support it at the time. They didn't support King. They thought King was an extremist. They thought Rosa Parks was an extremist or a traitor. So I think the first thing I would want people to get out of the book is just, in many ways, a kind of a reminder of this history and the ways that this history parallels the treatment of movements today. I think the second thing I would want to get at, which I was alluding to before, is the role that young people have played. And both in terms of pushing the movement forward and the ways that many adults get uncomfortable about that. So certainly 50 and 60 years ago, there's a similar kind of trepidation, like you're not doing it right, you're too bold, you're rude, you're not using the right, go slower. Again, similar kinds of nervousness that we see, against some of the organizing by young people today. Mm-hmm. So I think part of it is to sort of understand both the power of young people's organizing then and now, that just because some adults are not supportive or critical, that parallels what's happened in the past, but that young people have played such a key role in kind of many of the key moments of the civil rights movement. Again, yesterday was the anniversary of Claudette Colvin's arrest. Claudette Colvin was the 15-year-old who was arrested on a Montgomery bus in March of 1955, about 8 months before Rosa Parks is. The community's outraged, but a mass movement does not form behind Colvin. But one of the things people miss about Colvin is Colvin actually is one of 4 women who is on a case filed 3 months into the bus boycott. A federal case, people in Montgomery, activists in Montgomery, are worried that the state will just tie up Rosa Parks' case in state court, so they file a proactive case into federal court. 2 of the people on that case are teenagers. The lawyer for that case, Fred Gray, who's also Rosa Parks' lawyer, wanted a minister to be on it, but no minister was willing to put their name on it. And so 2 of the 4 people courageous enough to be on that case are teenagers, including Claudette Colvin. And that's the case that goes to the Supreme Court, and that's the case that desegregates Montgomery's buses. So I think remembering and knowing how many of these moments are pushed forward by teenagers, I think is powerful in terms of what teenagers can imagine today. And certainly I think we're seeing this with this emerging gun control movement, with the connections being made by kind of the young people in Parkland with other young people who've been organizing around gun control and gun violence already, tying issues together, right? So not, saying we don't want more security officers in school because they have been used against Black and brown kids often in school, and they don't make us safer, they make us less safe, right? So these kinds of connections that I think we're seeing people making today are hugely important. So I think there's a lot this history gives us, I hope, for kind of where we are today in this country and the movements we're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and more power to those kids, that's for sure. Jeanne Theoharis, Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Brooklyn College of the City, University of New York, joining us today. Her most recent book, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, The Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History. Jeanne, thank you so much for your time with us today. We do appreciate it and look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Michael Eggman, Democratic candidate for California's 10th, on his plans to flip the district.
We've got so much to talk about for this half hour, for this next hour, including taking a look at a key congressional race in California. So it's good to have you with us. Look forward to hearing from you and your comments on Twitter at BP Show. And we welcome... We've been talking a lot about Democratic efforts and the importance of taking back the House in 2018. Well, here's a man who's determined to do that one district at a time, starting with his district, the 10th Congressional District in the Central Valley of Candidate Michael Eggman. Michael, good to see you.
Good to see you, Bill. Thanks for having me.
We have worked together on a previous campaign, and it's great to see that you're there and you're still at it. Tell us, first of all, I know, not everybody knows, the 10th District. Where is it? What's it all about?
It's in the Central Valley of California, if you know where Modesto is. That's the
So sort of the North
district.
Central Valley, right?
North Central Valley.
Inland from San Francisco.
Yeah, just over the Altamont Pass from the Bay Area.
Mainly still, like the entire Central Valley, agricultural district?
Ag is our key economy there.
And a bedroom community, too, I guess, huh?
Yeah, for the Silicon Valley. It's we house the employees of the Silicon Valley, we like to say, because it's too expensive to buy in the Silicon Valley. So
I was just going to say,
so
house them because they can't afford to.
Right. So every morning at 5 a.m. you see a sea of taillights heading west, and then every night coming back you see a sea of headlights coming back to the district.
Right. In that district, if you were in the district today and you went around to coffee shops or whatever, would people be talking about Donald Trump and James Comey? Would they be talking about Vladimir Putin? Would they be talking about the fact that the government's going to run out of money this Friday? Or would they be talking about issues that are important to that district? And if so, what do you find there?
Well, you'd be talking about a mixture. I mean, people think Central Valley is just all ag, but we're really plugged in because we are so close to the Bay Area. But people are talking about, Russia. People are talking about Trump. People are talking about how the Republican Party is not being really recognized. I mean, we're talking about generational Republicans that live in the district. And I'm a beekeeper, so I work in ag. I work with a lot of our Republican friends. Mm-hmm. And, they invite me in for dinner. And around the dinner table, they're just telling me they're washing their hands of their party. They don't no longer recognize it. And they recognize that Jeff Denham, my opponent, is in real trouble this cycle, because instead of standing with the hardworking folks of the Central Valley, and we're hard workers there, Jeff Denham is not standing with them. He's standing with Trump. 538.com says he's voted with Trump 98.5% of the time.
So that's interesting. He's the incumbent Republican, Jeff Denham, and you came close to winning that seat the last time, as I recall. Right?
Yeah, it was he won re-election by the third narrowest margin in the country.
Really? Yeah. Right. So he has made a decision, and this is a decision a lot of Republicans are. Some I guess are wrestling with, right? But he's made a decision to stand with Donald Trump. No distance, right? No daylight.
In lockstep. I mean, the Modesto Bee, the biggest paper in the district, is quoted as saying he's a loyal Trump foot soldier in the Valley. So that's how much he's standing with Trump. And not only is he voting with Trump, he's not said a peep at anything that's coming out of the White House, whether it be on Russia, whether it be the White House chief of staff. We have a big DACA population in the district. Mm-hmm. And when the White House chief of staff referred to them as too lazy to get off their asses to sign up for DACA, not one peep from Jeff Denham.
Right.
Who's supposed to be a leader on the issue of immigration reform.
What, and in terms of, did the district vote for Trump, I guess?
No, the district voted for Clinton.
Really?
Yeah. For just under three percentage points.
Which says a lot, too,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
In terms of, so you think this is a, what's the phrase, a flippable district?
It's a flippable. If you think the Democratic wave is bigger than 3%, then this district is in play. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we just have to make sure we fight our best fight.
Have you, is this, I should know this, but the primary, are you the candidate yet, or is there a Democratic primary?
Like a lot of districts around the country, it's a crowded Democratic field. I'm kind of a late entrant. I didn't plan on running this cycle. As you know, running for office just doesn't involve the candidate, but involves your family too. So I wanted to give my wife, and I have two beautiful daughters, both in college right now. I want to kind of give them a break of the campaign. But look, through this past year, we've all watched in horror as the Trump agenda has just seemed to be steamrolling our country. But we've also watched, in admiration with the resistance grow, not just around the country and not just around California, but actually in the Central Valley.
Well, I've been on your email list for this cycle at any rate, so I hear from you often. I know you're really running an aggressive campaign. I can see that. I hear from you like every day. So when you go out to tell people, what is your message? I mean, they talk about Democrats need a message. I mean, what is your message to people? Why you, right? Why Democrat? Why change? And then why you? Yes.
Well, there's a thing called candidate district fit. And look, I'm a Latino, farmer in a majority minority ag district. So that's a perfect fit. And people know that the beekeeper is fighting for them. And now they know that Donald Trump and Jeff Denham are in lockstep, that Denham doesn't represent the values of the districts or the interests of the district. He just represents, Donald Trump, the 1%, and the big corporations. That's who he's focused on.
And on immigration, your position on either comprehensive immigration reform or DACA?
Look, my mom's family is immigrated to California from Zacatecas, Mexico. So this is I know the importance of this issue. I believe in comprehensive immigration reform. It strengthens families. It strengthens our our labor force. And look, in ag, that's an important labor force. And it strengthens our economy. The CBO says it would take $700 billion off of our deficit by 2033 if we could just pass comprehensive immigration reform. Denham, claims to be a leader on the issue, but heck, he's been in office since that Tea Party wave of 2010. What's he done? Talk is cheap.
How important is the immigrant community to California agriculture, or to agriculture in general?
Oh, it's tremendously important. I mean, look, we feed the country, if not the world. We're the Garden of Eden, and when it comes to time to harvest, we need an available workforce. And right now, because of the faltering policy on immigration reform, that workforce just isn't there. Year after year, that workforce dwindles because of the immigration issues that we have.
Are there still as many people pouring across the border as once was in California? I mean, back in the days when I was there, when I was state chair, when Pete Wilson was governor, there was a real problem of a flow of.
No, not these days. Border enforcement is tougher than ever. And so who's really taking advantage of the folks coming across the border right now? It's not the folks on this side of the border. It's the people that bring these folks on over. It's incredibly expensive now. It's incredibly dangerous, and that's why people, once they get here, they stay because it's too difficult to go back. Often they don't want, they don't want to stay here. They just want to come, earn a living, and go back to their families. But that's not being done right now.
Is a wall the answer?
Absolutely not. A medieval solution to a modern problem.
That's a good way of summing it up. Yeah, especially from what we saw last week with these prototypes of the wall. But every time Donald Trump talks about it, he changes what the wall is going to look like. It's going to be a see-through wall now, right? See?
Well, and Mexico is. Are they going to pay for it yet?
I don't even think Donald Trump claims that they're going to pay for it.
They've given up on that. They've just completely walked away from that. They know they're not going to make that happen.
They really have. Right. If you are a member of Congress, one of the issues that you're going to probably the first issues you're going to be asked to support or vote for would be the issue of gun safety. Okay, you represent a Central Valley district from California. Would you support a ban on assault weapons?
I would support a ban on assault weapons. But look, I believe in the Second Amendment. You just noticed or mentioned that I am from an ag district. So, there are guns out in that district. I grew up on a farm, and there's guns on the farm I grew up in. And my dad taught me how to use it, or any gun, just like a tool of the farm. So I think the Second Amendment is important. But look, we have to, he taught me to be smart about how to use a gun. You have to use your smarts, son. That's what he would say. And being smart is, look, let's not make guns available to the mentally ill. Or let's have background checks. Every gun that I've ever bought, I had to get a background check. We need that universal across the country. We want to make sure that felons don't have access to guns. We want to make sure that people with temporary restraining orders or domestic abusers don't have a gun, or mentally ill, or people on the no-fly list. Jeff Denham thinks all those people should have access to guns. And let me just say about this Parkland tragedy, not one word, not one thoughts and prayers, not one peep from Facebook, from Twitter, from anything from Congressman Denham after 17 innocent people, mostly children, lost their lives. Not one peep. I guess his A rating from the NRA doesn't allow it.
Is the NRA a powerful force in the district? Are they players in the district in a congressional seat like this?
Unfortunately, I think they're players everywhere. And that's, something that we need to overcome as a country. And I think, I can't wait to see the energy happening that's going to happen on the 24th for the March for Our Lives.
Oh yeah, it's going to be big, and I'll be out there.
The irony is,
I'm sure you will be wherever you are, but here in Washington D.C., it's going to be
the fantastic member of Congress Elizabeth Esty, the rep from Sandy Hook. I talked to her years ago about this issue, and she's like, "We're going to get gun reform through the mothers." The how we did it with drunk driving, with the Mad Mothers. Well, the Mad Mothers are going to, get this gun reform. Well, ironically, now it's not coming from the mothers; it's coming from the children themselves. I'm encouraged that we're really going to move the ball forward on this important issue.
Yeah, they are a powerful force like we haven't seen in a long time. I'm sure you followed what happened in Pennsylvania's 18th congressional district last week. We just talked about it with Ben Kamazar from the Hill. One of the ways that Connor Lamb made news was he said that if he were elected, he would not vote for Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House. Would you?
Look, what I'm 100% focused on right now is who's voting for Michael Eggman and winning the 10th congressional district, to give the people of the district the representation that they so desperately need and deserve. So that's my 100% focus. I don't know about the inside baseball of politics about who to vote for a leader. That's not my focus right now.
So you're not you're not committed to vote for her or against her at this point, right? It's
just not my focus right now. I'm worried about how to communicate with the voters of the district to make sure that Jeff Denham does not get reelected.
Does anybody in your district ask you how you're going to vote on Nancy Pelosi?
No, that's not what's on their mind. They talk to me about water, what, as you know, in an ag district is of the utmost importance. They talk to me about immigration reform. They talk to me about infrastructure. I mean, if you drive around the rural roads in not just my district, but around the state, I mean, it's, sometimes I hit potholes so big it's bounced beehives off the back of my truck. The American Society of Civil Engineers gives our country a D+ rating for infrastructure, which really reflects poorly on Congressman Denham, since he sits on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee.
Curious, not that this is the most important factor, but how much money do you have planned or figure out for running for Congress today that it will take to win a congressional seat?
Well, we raised about $2 million last time when we were extremely competitive. We came at a point and a half from the other side of the aisle to knock in this entrenched incumbent off.
So that's roughly
that's roughly what I think it's going to take to be competitive. But look, I don't. I'm a middle class guy running a middle class campaign. I don't take corporate PAC money. Who funds my campaign are just everyday working folks pitching in, what they can, when they can. And that's the same system we used last time. And we raised, about $2 million.
Right. And the website, by the way, it doesn't matter where you live in the country. It's important to support good Democratic candidates wherever they are. And California could, and I think will, take the lead in taking the House back for Democrats in 2018. No better place to start than in the 10th Congressional District at Michael Eggman. It's 2 G's, egg, like egg, michaeleggman.com. I mean, with that name, you should be raising chickens, not bees, right? I mean, if everything were normal. But all right, I want to ask you about a couple of things for California.
Sure.
Who's going to be the next governor of California? What's your gut tell you?
My gut.
Are you supporting anybody?
Well, I'm a delegate, and I did support Gavin Newsom. He's a Northern California guy. I supported my last campaign, and I'm supporting him.
Former mayor of San Francisco, now the lieutenant governor of California.
Yeah. A lot of energy behind his campaign. But interesting about California and our politics. With our top 2 system, the jungle primary, as they call it. I think it's going to really, help in districts like mine with regard to the Republican turnout versus the Democratic turnout, because I think it's going to be, with our top 2 system, I think it's going to be 2 Democrats at the top of the ticket in the general for governor. I think it's going to be 2 Democrats for Senate, lieutenant governor, attorney general, on down. Mm-hmm. So if our good friends on the other side of the aisle are just so demoralized by, I don't know if you've heard this term here, but they're calling it Trump fatigue. That's, the Republicans that are just so tired about hearing about Trump. So if we can combine Trump fatigue with, having all the big ticket items filled with Democrats, if just 5% of that, the Republican base that's so reliable stays home, we win this thing.
So having two Democrats at the top of the ticket for any of these,
right,
for most of these races,
right.
certainly, probably, I agree with you. Probably all of them would encourage Republicans to stay home and Democrats to come out.
I mean, I can't vote for governor, I can't vote for Senate.
Right. If it's two Democrats on the ticket for governor, it's Gavin Newsom and Antonio Villaraigosa or John Chung.
The one of the two. Yeah, they're both running strong campaigns. Villaraigosa, so people ask me my opinion. They say, well, the people I chat with in Southern California, they ask me about Newsom, and the people and vice versa.
Yeah.
But then I always throw in, well, what do you think about John Chung? And everyone knows about John Chung because, of course, he was the treasurer of the state and the controller.
Controller, right.
Yeah.
On the Senate side, Senator Dianne Feinstein running for re-election, and she's been there since 1992, I believe. Some people thought she might step down. She surprised everybody. She's running for another 6-year term. And Kevin DeLeon, the head of the state Senate, is challenging her in the primary. So the Senate race, you think, will end up with the two of them at the top of the ticket?
Yeah, I believe it will. Just like we did last year with Kamala Harris and Sanchez.
Right.
Or last cycle, I should say.
Who comes out of that the winner?
That one's a
have you endorsed?
No, I haven't endorsed anyone. I'm still wrestling with. I like Kevin's progressive policies, but of course, I love Senator Feinstein's steady leadership over the years. I'd hate for us to have two junior senators in the Senate. So I'm still calculating who would be the best representation for our state.
I want to ask you I know nothing about this except I've just read little articles here and there or heard things about the state of the bee kingdom these days, right, is not in great shape. Is that correct?
Oh, well,
I mean, bees as a species are threatened worldwide.
I have to be careful not to get in the weeds here. On this one, because,
please, no.
Yeah, because we'll
just a couple of minutes. But I mean, what are the problems and what's going on? Well,
I like to tell folks. So I'm a third generation beekeeper. That's what I do. It's how I.
So that means you raise honey, make honey. Is that with these bees? Is that?
Well, the business model used to be you would get half of your income from honey production and sale, and the other half from pollination. A lot of folks just think of bees. They think, oh yeah, honey, but people don't realize that bees are directly or indirectly responsible for every one out of every 3 bites of food we eat. Are related to a bee. So the big part of my business is pollination, right? Yeah. Whether it be almonds, cherries, apples, blueberries, and we also pollinate seed. So, all the hay that the cows eat, guess who pollinates that alfalfa seed are the bees. So when I do talks to, school kids, I ask them who likes. I'll name fruits, but then I'll also include cheeseburgers and ice cream, and let them draw the connection that bees are involved, in the whole food picture. So I like to tell folks, with regard to your question about what's going on with the bees, that bees are the canary in the coal mine, if you will, for the health of our environment. Well, as a country, we've lost over half of our domestic bee colonies in the last 25 years.
Really?
Over half.
Over half of the bee population?
Yes.
To disease? To
Well, there's a term for it, colony collapse disorder, which they say is a combination of different factors, whether it be pesticide issues, mite issues, bacterial or viral issues. But the big issue that I attribute most of it to is the issue of nutrition. If bees are a livestock, we're on the California Livestock Report, we're right under swine. And just like any other livestock, if you don't feed them properly, they're going to be susceptible to all those health issues. So with this climate crisis that we're in, where it's warm when it should be cool, cool when it should be warm, wet when it should be dry, etc., that directly affects the flora, which directly affects the bees' nutrition. And in this historic drought in California that we've had over the past 5-6 years, I'm a third generation, so I have these wonderful bee yards up in the Sierras or over on the coastal range, but I can't take them there. They're literally moonscapes or fire hazards right now. I could take them there, but the bees would starve to death. So now we have to be around irrigated crops. Well, when you're around irrigated crops, now you're around pesticides. And not just the old-fashioned pesticides. Now you have these new, chemically engineered neonics or genetically modified crops.
So I guess summing up, this is a real today impact of climate change.
It's
right? Global warming that we're already experiencing.
Yeah, and this is the thing. It hurts agricultural communities first and hardest. It kills crops. It kills livestock. It's killing my livestock. And if the reason, for almond pollination, you used to be able to, the almond growers need to get a commercial crop, they need to pollinate them with bees. And they used to be able to rent those bee hives for, $120 a hive. Now it's in excess of $200 because it's a supply and demand issue. So it's an economic issue as well, this climate crisis we're in.
Right. No, absolutely. And, I think more and more people recognize that. Sadly, we have...
except for Congressman Denham, President Trump and the Secretary of the EPA, Pruitt, they don't believe in climate change. No. They want to put their head in the sand.
They're all climate change deniers.
They're all deniers. And look, we don't have to choose between, doing something about climate change and helping our economy. We need to recognize the problem and look at it as an opportunity and start providing good green jobs out there. That's going to both help our economy and save our environment.
Amen. If we don't take climate change seriously, we're going to even further destroy the economy. Michael Eggman, he's our candidate, Democratic candidate in the 10th Congressional District in California. Very, very important district. And again, no matter where you live in the country, this is the kind of candidate we should be supporting, kind of race that we can win against a 98% Trumper. He's 100% Trumper. Michael Eggman is our guy in the 10th. It's michaeleggman.com, right? Yep, michaeleggman.com. And on Facebook.com, what is that?
Yeah, Facebook.com, Eggman for Congress.
All right, check in, find out more about Michael, help where you can. Michael, great to see you. Good luck. Okay?
Great to see you, Bill.
Go get him.
Thank you.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Adam Winkler, Jeanne Theoharis, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.